3 years into Russia's war against Ukraine, Moscow's Baltic neighbours are trying to prepare for the potential threat of war on their own soil. Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia are constructing the so-called Baltic Defense Line to ward off a Russian attack. DW correspondent Juri Rescheto went to the Latvian border near the town of Karsava to find out how the border region is strengthening its defense capabilities.
Can these concrete blocks stop Russian tanks? That's the job for so-called Dragon's Teeth near Latvia's border with Russia. They're part of the Baltic Defense Line, a major project shared by Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia against the potential threat from neighboring Russia.
We must by no means underestimate the imperialist attitude and the level of aggressiveness in our neighboring country. I don't want to make any assumptions here about what someone on the other side of the border might be up to, but we must strengthen our armed forces and our defense capabilities with our partners, without fear or panic.
The defense line goes beyond Dragon's Teeth. It also includes underground bunkers, storage for landmines near the border and securing supply routes. Few people in the Baltic states expect an imminent Russian attack, but traces of the Soviet past are still visible in Riga. And many Latvians are suspicious of their former occupiers. Today, 33 years after the fall of the Soviet Union and 2.5 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, defending their independence is more important to Latvians than ever.
I think it's necessary. I'm glad that it's finally been decided.
The fact that the external border is being strengthened is very good.
I think it's an unnecessary waste of money, because it's useless from a military point of view.
I don't think Russia would attack Latvia. I think Latvia is of no interest to Russia.
Strengthening the border also serves another purpose: the fight against irregular migration. One of the ways that Russia and neighboring Belarus are waging a so-called hybrid war against the West. Thousands of migrants have been trying to enter Europe illegally via the Baltic states. Authorities say they pose a threat to the eternal security of the EU. New border installations, such as this recently constructed fence, are meant to keep them out.
A border fence like this is a real deterrent. You can't easily climb it. So the migrants look for a place where there is no fence, or they damage the fence and leave traces behind. The border guards notice this and immediately start looking for the perpetrators.
Ultimately, the Baltic Defense Line is intended to stop or at least slow down a possible Russian invasion. An important part of a large-scale NATO defense project in response to the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine.
DW's Juri Rescheto joins us now from Riga. Juri, how effective will this Baltic Defense Line really be?
Well, at least that is what is supposed to be effective, but no one can say whether, and if so, how the potential attack on the Baltic states could really go. We remember how quickly the Russian army captured large areas of Ukraine in the first days of the war in 2022. The war, and still are no border fortifications, no installations between Russia and Ukraine. There is a so-called green border. The same was the case in the Baltic states until recently. So until recently, there was not even a fence on the border with Russia, neither in Lithuania nor here in Latvia or Estonia. That is changing. In addition to that, various other installations, fortifications are planned, bunkers, storage facilities for landmines, to physically prevent the enemy from advancing quickly. But the Baltic Defense Line is not the only measure because the war is not only fought with tanks. Baltic countries do a lot to protect themselves from, for example, from Russian spies or to counter Russian propaganda and disinformation, and so on and so on.
Now, Baltic countries have been warning of Russian aggression since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but mainly were ignored for years until the war began. Are they finally being heard?
Yeah, the Baltic states have always said that the war didn't start in 2022, but in 2014, namely the war in Donbass after the annexation of Crimea, which wasn't taken seriously enough in the West. That has changed. The three Baltic states in the east are being heard now. It's no surprise that the Baltic states are also among the countries that support Ukraine the most in relation to their GDP. All three states have signed bilateral agreements with Kyiv for the next 10 years. For military and economic support. Then Baltic states are among the strongest supporters of the sanctions against Russia. They are demanding, for example, that the sanctions remain in force even after the Russians have withdrawn from Ukraine one day. And all of this is supported by the population here. People here are donating a lot to Ukraine. In Lithuania, for example, people donated money for combat drones, for city buses. Here in Latvia, people donate used cars to send to Ukraine, and so on and so on.
Talking about average people, not all Latvians in your report, for example, seem to be convinced by the Baltic Defense Line. What's the mood like in the Baltic countries?
That's true. Hardly anyone here is afraid of the Russians will invade soon. I've never heard something similar in the 2.5 years I've been living here. People don't think about the war. The same is true of Germany, for example. But in contrast to Germany, the Balts have a very different relationship with Russia, because for many here, the Russians were clearly occupiers. And not for everyone, of course, because tens of thousands of Russians were relocated to these countries in Soviet times, and they still live today here, most of them peacefully and without problems, together with the Latvians. In normal life, I will feel zero tensions between the two peoples. For security authorities, however, many of these Russians living here, by the way, with Russian passports, are a security risk.
Juri Rescheto there reporting from Riga. Thank you, Juri.